Kilira Vethson had heard enough stories about humans to last 3 lifetimes, and she found every single one of them ridiculous beyond measure. She sat at the long dining table aboard the Valanthor's Grace, a diplomatic vessel carrying delegates from 12 different species to a peace summit on Nexus Station, and she tried very hard not to roll her eyes as the Thessian merchant across from her continued his dramatic tale. And then, the merchant said, his 4 eyes wide with excitement, the human soldier crawled through 2 miles of burning wreckage with both legs broken, dragging 3 wounded companions behind him, and he did not stop until he reached the evacuation point. Several delegates gasped in amazement, but Kilira simply picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip. She was Aelori, and her people had been warriors for over 40,000 years before humans had even learned to walk upright on their little blue planet. Her crystalline skin caught the light of the chandeliers above, casting rainbow patterns across the white tablecloth, and the 3 honor marks tattooed along her neck proved that she was no stranger to combat herself. She had earned those marks in ritual battle against some of the finest blade dancers on her homeworld, and she had trained since childhood in the ancient ways of war. The Thessian merchant was not finished with his tales. "I have heard," he continued, leaning forward with breathless enthusiasm, "that humans possess something called spite, a force of will so powerful that it allows them to survive wounds that should kill them instantly, simply because they refuse to die before completing their mission." This time Kilira could not hold back her laughter. It burst out of her, sharp and musical like breaking glass, and every head at the table turned toward her. "Forgive me," she said, though her tone made it clear she was not sorry at all. "But I cannot sit here and listen to such obvious nonsense without saying something." The merchant blinked at her with all 4 eyes. "You do not believe the stories about human warriors?" "I believe that humans are very good at telling stories about themselves," Kilira replied, setting down her glass with a delicate click. "But stories are not the same as truth, my friend." She gestured around the table at the assembled delegates, at the towering Vorn with their armored scales, at the graceful Selenari with their razor-sharp claws, and at her own Aelori companions with their millennia of martial tradition. "Look at us," she said. "We are surrounded by species that have evolved for combat, species with natural weapons and armor and abilities that humans can only dream of, and yet we are supposed to believe that these soft-skinned primates are somehow the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy." She shook her head slowly, a pitying smile on her lips. "Humans have no claws, no fangs, no armor, no venom, no telepathy, no natural weapons of any kind, and their bodies are so fragile that a simple fall can shatter their bones." The Thessian merchant opened his mouth to protest, but Kilira was not finished. "They live for less than a century if they are lucky, which means they barely have time to master anything before they grow old and die. And their senses are so dull that they cannot even see in the dark without artificial assistance." She laughed again, more softly this time. "The legends you speak of are simply what weak species invent to comfort themselves, stories they tell to make themselves feel important in a galaxy full of beings who are genuinely superior to them." Silence fell over the table, and Kilira felt a small surge of satisfaction at having finally said what everyone with any sense should be thinking. Then she noticed that several delegates were looking at something behind her, their expressions carefully neutral in a way that suggested discomfort. She turned in her seat and found herself looking at a human. He sat at the far end of the table, alone, wearing the simple dress uniform of some human military organization, and he was watching her with calm gray eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. She had barely noticed him when the dinner began, had dismissed him as just another minor delegate from an unimportant species, but now she studied him more carefully. He was older than most humans she had seen, with gray hair at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years and experience, and he held himself with a quiet stillness that she found oddly unsettling. Commander Elias Vance, one of her Aelori companions, whispered to her, "The human military attaché assigned to the summit." Kylera nodded and turned back to face the table, but she could still feel those gray eyes on her back. "Perhaps the commander would like to defend his species," she said loudly enough for him to hear. "Perhaps he has some legendary tales of human heroism to share with us?" She waited for his response, expecting anger or embarrassment or desperate attempts to prove her wrong. Instead, when she glanced back at him, she saw only a small smile on his weathered face. The kind of smile that held no offense, but also no surrender. He said nothing at all. Kylera found his silence irritating in a way she could not quite explain, and she told herself it was because he knew she was right and had no argument to offer. The dinner continued, and the conversation moved on to other topics, to politics and trade agreements and the upcoming summit. But Kylera could not quite shake the memory of those calm gray eyes. Later that night, she returned to her quarters and prepared for sleep. Putting the human commander out of her thoughts entirely, he was just a representative of a species that had gotten lucky, a species that had somehow stumbled into the galactic community despite having no real claim to importance. And tomorrow, she would have forgotten he even existed. She fell asleep easily, dreaming of home, of the crystal spires of Aelor Prime and the Academy of Blades where she had trained as a child. The ship was quiet around her, peaceful in the vast emptiness of neutral space, and nothing seemed wrong at all. Then the alarms began to scream. Kylera was on her feet before she was fully awake, her hand already reaching for the ceremonial blade she kept beside her bed, her heart's pounding with sudden adrenaline. Red emergency lights flooded her quarters, painting everything in the color of blood, and she could hear shouting in the corridor outside. She did not know it yet, but her education was about to begin. The Kethmari had come out of nowhere. 3 warships had decloaked around the Velenthor's grace, like predators emerging from tall grass, and within minutes they had disabled the engines and destroyed the communication arrays with surgical precision. Kylera ran through the corridors with her blade drawn, her crystalline skin glowing faintly with stress hormones as she searched for the other Aelori delegates. All around her, the ship was falling into chaos. She could hear weapons fire somewhere below her, could hear screaming from multiple directions, could feel the vibration of hull breaches through the deck plates beneath her feet. The Kethmari were boarding. She knew them by reputation. Matt knew that they were insectoid slavers who had terrorized the outer systems for centuries, knew that they did not attack ships to destroy them, but to harvest the beings inside high-value hostages from 12 different species would be worth billions on the black market. And the delegates aboard this ship were the most valuable cargo the Kethmari could have hoped to find. Kylera found the Aelori delegation huddled in a conference room on Deck 4, and Ambassador Veth Kal grabbed her arm the moment she entered. "Kylera, thank the stars!" the old diplomat gasped, his crystalline face pale with fear. "You must protect us! You are the only one among us with combat training!" She nodded grimly and took up a position by the door, her blade held ready. At her 2 hearts beating a war rhythm in her chest, she would die with honor if it came to that, would take as many of these insect slavers with her as she could, would make her ancestors proud. But the Kethmari did not come for them directly. Instead, she heard the sounds of organized movement in the corridors outside, heard the clicking speech of the raiders as they systematically cleared each section of the ship, heard them herding other delegates toward some central location. They were being methodical, professional, and that terrified her more than blind violence would have. A Kethmari squad finally reached their door, and Kylera prepared to fight. But the raiders simply pointed their weapons at the Aelori and gestured for them to move. "Come!" one of them clicked in broken common. "Cargo bay, all delegates. And no harm if cooperate." Ambassador Vethakal placed a hand on Kylira's sword arm. "Do not," he whispered. "There are too many of them, and they want us alive, which means we have time." Every instinct in her body screamed for her to fight, but she knew the ambassador was right, knew that a dead warrior could protect no one, and so she lowered her blade and allowed the raiders to escort them into the corridor. They walked for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, passing through sections of the ship that showed signs of brief and brutal combat. She saw dead crew members, saw scorch marks from plasma weapons, saw the broken bodies of those who had tried to resist. Then they turned a corner near the engine room, and Kylira stopped breathing Govern. Kethmari lay dead in the hallway ahead, but they had not been shot. It had not been killed by plasma fire or any weapon she could identify. They had been broken. One raider's arm had been twisted completely around. The chitin armor that covered its body cracked and shattered from some tremendous impact. Another had been driven headfirst into a wall panel with such force that the metal had warped around its skull. A third lay in pieces, literally torn apart by hands that must have possessed impossible strength. The Kethmari escort stopped at the sight, their antennae twitching with something that looked very much like fear, and Kylira heard them clicking rapidly to each other in their own language. "What did this?" Ambassador Vethkal whispered beside her, his voice trembling. A young Thessian crewman was hiding in a storage alcove nearby, and he looked up at them with eyes that had seen something they could not forget. "The human," he breathed. "The human is still fighting." Kylira felt something cold move through her chest. She looked at the bodies again, at the sheer brutal efficiency of the kills, at the message that had been left for anyone who came after. This was not the work of a soft-skinned primate who had no natural weapons. This was the work of something else entirely. The Kethmari escort grew nervous and hurried the delegates along, pushing them past the carnage and toward the cargo bay, and Kylira went with them in a daze. Her mind kept returning to those gray eyes, to that small smile, to the silence that had seemed like surrender, but now felt like something else. When they reached the cargo bay, they found dozens of other delegates already gathered there, but surrounded by armed Kethmari who watched them with compound eyes full of greed. The raider commander stood on a raised platform overlooking the hostages, a massive insectoid creature with scarred chitin and a voice like grinding stones. "Attention all aboard this vessel," he broadcast through the ship's communication system. "We have taken your delegates. We have taken your ship, but one among you continues to resist." He paused, and Kylira could hear something in his voice that sounded almost like respect. "The human," the commander continued. "Commander Elias Vance of the Terran Defense Force, you have killed 17 of my warriors in the last hour, and I congratulate you on your skill." 17, Kylira thought, her mind struggling to process the number. "And he has killed 17 of them alone in 1 hour. But this resistance must end," the commander said. "Surrender yourself now, human, or I will begin executing hostages, starting with the child." He gestured, and 2 raiders dragged a young Thessian girl to the front of the crowd, her 4 eyes streaming with tears. Kylira gripped her blade and prepared to act, prepared to die defending the innocent if she must, but before she could move, the lights went out. Every light on every deck, plunging the entire ship into absolute darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, Kylira heard something that made her blood run cold. It was laughter, quiet, calm, human laughter, and then the screaming began. The cargo bay had become a prison of shadows and fear. Emergency backup lights provided only the faintest red glow. Barely enough to see the outlines of bodies around her, and Kylira could feel the terror spreading through the hostages like a disease. The Kethmari were afraid too. She could see it in the way they moved, the way their weapons swept back and forth across the darkness, the way they clicked at each other in rapid bursts of their harsh language. One of the hostages, a Selenari tech officer who had been captured near the bridge, still had a stolen Kethmari communication device hidden in her robes. She had been translating the enemy transmissions in whispered fragments, and what she reported made Kylira's blood run cold. "Squad 4 is not responding," the tech officer murmured, her feline eyes wide in the darkness. "The command is ordering Squad 5 to investigate their last known position." Minutes passed in terrible silence. Then the radio crackled again. "Squad 5 is requesting immediate backup," the tech officer translated, her voice shaking. "They say something is wrong. They say there is blood everywhere but no bodies. They say—" She stopped, listening. "They say the walls are talking," she continued. "They say there are words written in Kethmari blood. They say the word is run." A Vorn delegate near Kylira made a low, rumbling sound of confusion. "What does that mean?" he asked. "What kind of warrior writes messages in the blood of his enemies?" Kylira had no answer, but something in her chest was beginning to shift, beginning to understand that she had made a terrible mistake in her judgment. The translations continued, each one worse than the last. "Squad 6 has found survivors from Squad 4, the tech officer whispered. "But the survivors will not stop screaming. They keep saying the darkness is alive. They keep saying eyes are watching them. Squad 7 reports that someone has sealed the doors to Deck 3 from the inside. They cannot get through. They are requesting plasma cutters. Squad 7 is no longer responding. Command is ordering all units to converge on Deck 5. They want to overwhelm the human with numbers." The Kethmari commander in the cargo bay was pacing now, his massive form moving back and forth with agitation, his compound eyes scanning the shadows, as if expecting the human to appear at any moment. "Squad 8 has reached Deck 5, the tech officer translated. "They report no sign of the human. They are conducting a sweep." A long pause. "Squad 8 reports they have found Squad 7. Another pause. Longer this time. "The squad leader is requesting permission to retreat," the tech officer said, and even in the darkness, Kylira could see her hands trembling. "He says his warriors are refusing to advance. He says one of his soldiers found a message carved into the chitin of a dead raider." "What message?" Kylira asked, her voice barely audible. The tech officer swallowed hard. "I am not locked in here with you." The cargo bay fell silent. Kylira had trained in the art of war for her entire adult life, had studied the tactics of 100 different species, had learned to fight with honor and skill and precision. What the human was doing was something else entirely. This was not combat as she understood it, and not the measured exchange of violence between warriors who respected each other. This was predation. He was hunting them in the darkness, picking them off one by one, leaving survivors specifically to spread fear among their companions. He was turning the ship into a maze of terror, and the Kethmari, for all their numbers and weapons, were being systematically destroyed. From within, new transmission. The tech officer gasped suddenly. "A squad leader is requesting immediate evacuation. He says he is the only survivor of his unit. He says the human took them all in less than a minute. He says the human was wounded," she continued. "He says he shot the human twice in the torso, but the human did not fall. The human did not even slow down. He says the human looked at him with dead eyes and told him to run, so told him to find his commander and deliver a message." The Kethmari commander spun toward the nearest radio, shouting in his own language. The tech officer translated his question. "What message?" A voice came through the radio, high and trembling with terror. "He says to tell you that you have 5 minutes, the tech officer whispered. "He says to tell you that no one is leaving this ship alive." The commander roared with fury and grabbed the young Thessian child, dragging her toward the cargo bay doors. "Human!" he bellowed into the darkness beyond. "I know you can hear me. I know you are listening. Show yourself now, or I will kill this child. I will kill them all." Silence answered him. Long, terrible silence. Then a voice spoke from somewhere in the ventilation system above them, calm and conversational. As if discussing the weather. "You have 5 minutes," it said. "I would use them to make peace with whatever gods your kind believes in." The commander fired his plasma rifle at the ceiling, but there was no one there. The human had already moved. Kylera stood in the darkness, surrounded by terrified hostages and increasingly desperate raiders, and she finally understood what she was witnessing. The legends about human warriors were not exaggerations. They were understatements, and in 5 minutes she would see what happened when a human stopped holding back. The Kethmari commander had prepared for the human. 30 warriors stood in defensive positions throughout the cargo bay, their plasma rifles aimed at every entrance, their compound eyes scanning every shadow motion sensors had been placed at each doorway, and guaranteed to detect any movement before it became a threat. The hostages had been pushed to the center of the room, positioned as living shields that would force the human to hesitate. It was a perfect trap, designed by a veteran commander who had captured thousands of ships and millions of slaves, and then Commander Elias Vance walked through the main door. He did not sneak in through the ventilation, did not drop from the ceiling, did not use any of the tricks that had made him a ghost in the corridors above. He simply walked through the front entrance, calm and steady, as if he were arriving for a business meeting. The motion sensors screamed their warnings, and 30 weapons turned toward him at once. He stopped in the doorway, and for the first time Kylera saw him clearly in the red emergency lights. He was wounded. A badly wounded burns covered his left arm, and a makeshift bandage around his thigh was soaked through with blood that was still dripping onto the deck plates. Cuts and bruises marked his face, and he moved with the stiffness of someone whose body had been pushed far beyond its limits. In his hands was a Kethmari plasma rifle taken from one of his many victims. On his belt hung 3 grenades, also stolen from the enemy. He should not have been standing, let alone fighting, by any reasonable measure. He should have been dead hours ago. But his eyes, those gray eyes that Kylera had found so irritating at dinner, were clear and focused and utterly without fear. "Commander Vance," the Kethmari leader said, recovering from his surprise, "you have finally decided to surrender." Vance tilted his head slightly. Considering the question, no, he said simply. And then he moved. Kylera had trained her entire life in combat, had studied with the finest blade dancers on Alor Prime, had earned 3 honor marks in ritual duels against opponents who could have killed most beings in a heartbeat. Her crystalline eyes could perceive 16 frames per second, more than almost any other species in the galaxy, and she could barely track what happened next. Vance did not fight like an Alori, did not move with grace or elegance or any concern for form. He fought like a force of nature, like a storm given human shape, like something that existed only to destroy. His first shot took a raider through the throat, and before the body hit the ground, he was already moving, already firing. Already closing the distance to the next target. A Kethmari lunged at him with a blade, and Vance caught the arm, twisted, and used the raider's own momentum to throw him into 2 of his companions. He took a plasma graze across his ribs that should have dropped him, that would have dropped any sane being, and he did not even slow down. His rifle ran dry, and he used it as a club, shattering chitin and breaking limbs, then discarded it and pulled a blade from a fallen raider. The Kethmari fired wildly, hitting each other as often as they hit him, their formation collapsing into chaos as this impossible human tore through them like paper. Kylera watched a raider drive a blade through Vance's shoulder, watched the human grab the hand that held the weapon and break it with a single sharp twist. It watched him pull the blade from his own flesh and use it to open the raider's throat. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds now, his uniform soaked red, his movements growing slower, but never stopping. Never stopping. A human body was supposed to shut down when it took this much damage, was supposed to go into shock and collapse and die, but Vance's body seemed to have rejected that possibility entirely. He fought through pain that would have killed lesser beings, fought through blood loss that should have rendered him unconscious, fought through wounds that his own species' medical texts would have classified as fatal. And in his eyes there was no rage, no battle, fury, no berserker madness. There was only calm, cold purpose. The Kethmari commander grabbed the Thessian child and backed toward the far wall, he holding her in front of him as a shield. "Stop!" he shrieked, his confident voice now high with terror. "Stop, or I will kill her!" Vance stopped. He stood in a circle of broken bodies, breathing hard, blood dripping from his hands and his wounds, and the blade he still held. The cargo bay was silent, except for the groaning of dying raiders. "Let her go," Vance said, his voice rough but steady, "and I will make your death quick." The commander laughed, a desperate sound that held no humor. "You cannot shoot me without hitting her, human. You cannot—" Vance raised his hand, and Kylyra saw that he had picked up a fallen plasma pistol at some point during the carnage. The shot came so fast that even her enhanced vision barely registered it. It passed through the commander's left eye at an angle that should have been impossible. That should have hit the child, that defied every law of physics and probability. The Kethmari commander fell without a sound, and the Thessian child tumbled into the arms of a nearby delegate, unharmed. Vance stood alone in a cargo bay full of the dead and dying. His plasma pistol was empty. His blade slipped from fingers that no longer had the strength to hold it, and then, finally, his body began to fail. He swayed on his feet, and his eyes found Kylyra across the room. She had expected triumph in that gaze, expected pride or bloodlust, or the savage joy of victory. Instead, she saw only exhaustion, and beneath that, something like sorrow. He had killed so many tonight, had done terrible things to protect strangers who had mocked him just hours before. And there was no joy in it for him. There never had been. "Get to the shuttles," he said, 4 words that cost him the last of his strength. Then Commander Elias Vance collapsed to the deck and did not move again. The survivors reached the shuttle bay in a daze, moving through corridors that had become graveyards. Kylyra helped carry the wounded, helped comfort the terrified, helped organize the evacuation, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was still in that cargo bay, watching a wounded human tear through 30 armed raiders like they were nothing. The remaining Kethmari had fled to their ships the moment their commander fell, their will to fight completely shattered by a single man who refused to die. A consortium patrol arrived within the hour, in responding to a distress beacon that Vance had secretly reactivated sometime during his one-man war. The medics who boarded the ship found him still breathing, barely, his body having finally surrendered to wounds that should have killed him long before the battle ended. "I have never seen anything like this," one of the doctors told Kylyra later, shaking his head in disbelief. "By all medical standards, he should have died at least 3 times over. His body was running on nothing but adrenaline and sheer will for the last hour of the fight." He paused, looking at the readouts on his medical scanner. "His species has a term for this state," he continued. "They call it a survival drive, but that does not really capture what it is. It is more like his body simply refused to accept the reality of its own death." Kylyra said nothing. She had no words for what she had witnessed. The survivors were taken to Nexus Station, and Vance was rushed to the medical center, where the finest doctors in the sector worked for 16 hours to save his life against all odds. They succeeded. Kylyra spent those 16 hours reading his service file, truly reading it for the first time. She had dismissed him so easily at dinner, had seen only a representative of a young and unimpressive species, had not bothered to learn anything about the man himself. Now she learned everything. Commander Elias Vance had served in the Terran Defense Force for 23 years. He had been present at the Martian siege. and where human colonists had held out against overwhelming odds for 6 months until relief arrived, he had led the evacuation of Kelvin 7, personally carrying wounded civilians to safety while the colony burned around him, and he had defended Outpost Viridia against Kethmari raiders, holding a single corridor for 19 hours to allow civilian transports to escape 19 hours alone. She read the reports from that battle, read the testimony of the survivors who had watched him fight, read the medical records that documented wounds that should have been fatal. The humans had a word for warriors like him: veteran. It meant survivor, meant someone who had seen so much death that they had made peace with their own. It meant someone who had learned to keep fighting long after hope was gone, long after the body begged for rest. Long after any reasonable being would have surrendered, Kylera finally understood what she had mocked so carelessly. Humans were not mighty like the Aelori, were not ancient or powerful or blessed with natural weapons. What they had was something else. They had refusal. Refusal to stop when the body failed. Refusal to surrender when the odds demanded it. Refusal to let fear become anything more than fuel for the fire that burned inside them. The legends were not exaggerations told by a weak species to comfort themselves. The legends were understatements, pale shadows of a truth that no other species could truly comprehend. 3 days later, Vance woke in the medical center. Kylera was there when his eyes opened, sitting in a chair beside his bed, holding something wrapped in silk. He looked at her for a long moment. And then she saw recognition in those gray eyes, saw that he remembered her from the dinner, remembered her mockery. "You are still here," he said, his voice rough from days of disuse. "I am," she replied. She unwrapped the silk and revealed what lay within. It was an Aelori honor blade, ancient and beautiful, its edge sharp enough to cut light itself. These blades were given only to warriors who had proven themselves beyond all doubt, only to those who had demonstrated courage and skill that even the proudest Aelori could not deny. In 40,000 years of martial tradition, fewer than 100 had been given to those outside the Aelori species. "Among my people," Kylera said quietly, "we have a saying: the greatest warrior is the one who fights without glory, bleeds without complaint, and then wins without pride." She held out the blade to him. "I did not understand those words until I met you." Vance looked at the blade for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he smiled, that same small smile she had seen at the dinner, the one she had once mistaken for cowardice. "Keep it," he said. "I have enough scars to remember this by." Kylera wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he take this honor that he had so clearly earned. But she saw something in his eyes that stopped her. He was not refusing out of false modesty. He simply did not need external validation for what he was. He knew what he had done, knew what he was capable of, and that knowledge was enough. She nodded slowly and wrapped the blade again. "Thank you," she said, and the words meant more than she could express. Vance closed his eyes. "I'm exhausted even by this brief conversation. Get some rest, diplomat," he murmured, "and next time you hear stories about human warriors, try not to laugh." She left him to sleep and returned to her own quarters on the station. A month later, Kylera went home to Aelor Prime. She returned to the Academy of Blades, where she had trained as a child, and she requested permission to add a new lesson to the curriculum. The masters were skeptical at first. A study of human warriors seemed beneath the dignity of an institution with 40,000 years of tradition. But Kylera showed them the recordings from the Valanthor's grace, showed them what a single wounded human had done against impossible odds, and their skepticism turned to silence. The lesson was approved. On the first day of teaching, Kylera stood before a class of young Aelori warriors, their crystalline faces full of pride and certainty, and she saw herself in them. She saw the arrogance she had once possessed, the casual dismissal of those who seemed weaker. "Today," she said, "we will begin our study of human warriors." Several students laughed, just as she had laughed at that dinner so long ago. Kylera only smiled. "I understand your amusement," she said. "I once felt the same way, and then I witnessed a human in combat." She activated the holographic display behind her, showing the first images from the cargo bay. "Pray," she told them, "that you never have to learn the way I did." The laughter stopped, and the lesson began.